by this time, numerous night jumps while he was up in Alaska, and many winter jumps here in Michigan's climate. We also know that he was a trained paratrooper with the U.S. Army, and that later he was U.S. Air Force Reserve, and he was in the rescue and survival specialist in that department. Walter knew what he was doing in selecting the chute, and the weather certainly didn't deter him. The FBI claims that D.B. Cooper's flight route took him directly south towards Portland. Well, we know where Walter landed. It was near Cle Elum, Washington, which is almost directly east of Seattle. The FBI claimed that the exact location or drop zone had never really been determined. Well, we know that Walter interacted with Jeff Osadich, a former law enforcement officer, in a cafe within an hour of the time the plane left Seattle. We also know that Walter's friend drove to pick him up, and we know the route that he took to go back to Heartline to Walter's home. The FBI claimed that Cooper most likely died in the jump. This in spite of the fact that there were no missing persons reports filed during that time that matched anywhere remotely the description of Cooper. But we also know that Walter survived. The FBI claimed that Cooper could not have spent the ransom money without being discovered. We know that Walter took much of the money, most of it, and walked across the border into Canada and deposited it into a bank in Canada in a safe deposit box. But in the few months after the hijacking, he also used the money to buy a home on land contract with only a $600 down payment. He bought a car, and he also bought furniture. Now, despite all these differences, the most distinct characteristics of the D.B. Cooper person, they match closely with that of Walter. Walter was a heavy smoker of Raleigh cigarettes. Walter typically drank liquor when he was nervous. He was the same height, same hair color, the same build, and he was wearing the same clothes when Jeff found him, the reported Cooper wearing. Walter was a man with the ability, the opportunity, the desperation, and the fearlessness to pull this off. So the questions come up is, why would the authorities divert attention from the actual flight path where we found Walter? Or why would the FBI interview nearly every parachutist in the entire Northwest, except for the person who had probably the most jumps of anyone at that time in that area? And he was also registered with the United States Parachuting Association as C99, the 99th person to be certified with them. Most importantly, why wasn't he caught? You see, the hijacking was just the beginning of the story. 2 months after the hijacking, Walter was at work, and two men in hard hats came up and said, "You want to have a drink in a local bar after work?" And he agreed to do that. He met him at the bar. They sat down at the table, ordered a drink, and one of the men looked to Walter and said, "One question. Do you want to go to prison?" Walter wisely answered no. The man finally said, "Then you work for us." They stood up and walked out of the bar. After 2 years of training, this man with an 8th grade education, a mediocre welder, a convicted felon on the run, got his first passport under an assumed name and traveled around the world into some of the most volatile countries with passports from the United States, the United Kingdom, and KGB identification, as you see in the cases over here. We believe they had bigger plans for him than simply going to prison. I told you I'm really a skeptic, but with the overwhelming amount of evidence that we have revealed in this book, I am absolutely convinced Walter Recca was the real D.B. Cooper. I'd like to now introduce you to Joe Koenig, an investigator of 45 years experience, to explain to you the task that we assigned to him.
Thank you, Vern. The first evidence I looked at was Walt's alleged diary and contact books. I was impressed the entries appeared to be contemporaneous. The entries were made at the time the incidents occurred, or appeared that way, with different inks, and the entries were angled, all adding to the document's believability and authenticity. I analyzed the various passports and identification pieces, showing Walter's different aliases. There were a lot of them. The passports showing a good deal of foreign travel, the vaccination records also showing lots of activity. When visiting Carl, I saw more original evidence. Carl's trailer was filled with evidence, photographs and articles posted all around the walls and on his desk and even on the floor. Looked like a movie scene. My next task was to help gather and evaluate evidence, interview witnesses where possible, and try to determine their evidentiary value. On Carl, I evaluated the 3.5 hours of audio tapes to get a fix on his communication patterns, how he enunciated words, his talking rhythm, and whether there were changes in those patterns. I found no changes in patterns. I evaluated all the documents for believability and authenticity. I conducted face-to-face interviews with Carl to better understand his communication patterns and gain information. Loretta, Carl's wife, was present during most of the recordings and discussions between Carl and Walt. I assessed her communication patterns and body language as Carl spoke to me to detect if Loretta agreed with or believed in what Carl was telling me. Loretta consistently showed agreement. On Jeff O'Shaughnessy, aka Cowboy, I conducted a phone interview with Jeff to get a feel for his speaking rhythms, how he enunciated words, and to get a feel for his communication patterns. I then used that knowledge to conduct a forensic examination of the transcript of Vern's interview with him and a forensic examination of a handwritten statement Jeff had provided us following Vern's taped interview. I compared our documents with respect to Walt. I compared our documents to FBI records and reports to identify consistencies and discrepancies. I found no discrepancies that eliminated Walt as a suspect. Instead, I found amazing consistencies. I evaluated Walter's audio portion in the 3.5 hours of audio tapes to get a fix on his communication patterns, how he enunciated words, his talking rhythm and pace, and whether there were changes in those patterns. I found no changes in pattern. I found it particularly significant that Jeff O'Shaughnessy, aka Cowboy, his statement of events on the night of 11/24/1971 was identical to Walt's statement that he gave Carl 5 years earlier. In my opinion, Carl, Walt, and Jeff all provided truthful statements. The auto tapes and transcripts, Walt's last testament, provided me with great evidence. My analysis told me Walt was not forced or coerced to make his statements to Carl, that he made the statements freely and voluntarily. The statements and last testament contain Walt's admissions to all the elements of robbery and hijacking, constituting a very good confession that could be used in a criminal proceeding. Based on his confession and all the corroborating evidence, Walt, if still alive, would be prosecuted for the hijacking of Northwest 305. I believe that Walter Recca is D.B. Cooper. And with that, let me introduce Carl Lauren, Walt's best friend.
I'd like to thank all of you for being here today. I'm glad that you came. My best friend Walter was a daredevil. He was determined, he was fearless, he was tough as nails and had a temper, and he could carry more pain than any man I ever knew. But he was always sweet to the ladies. He was a ladies' man. Called all ladies by, hello, young lady, you'd say to him. He always wanted to be in the CIA. And I always got the feeling that when he jumped with our team, the Michigan Parachute Team, it was a means of survival, not really for the thrills. He was looking for something far beyond that. We didn't know it at the time. He hated being poor. He often said he'd better be dead than poor, was his mantra. He worked for so many jobs but couldn't seem to keep them. But on the other hand, he was a steel worker, and the jobs there went from job to job. And I knew he resorted to theft and robbery when he was in a pinch. And most of the time it was robbing a bank. For Walt, life was tough, and he felt that he had to be tougher. He was a tough guy. In 2000, I told Walt I expected him of being D.B. Cooper. He would not say yes or no right away, but over the next 8 years, Walt and I had many phone calls, thousands. Meetings and mailed documents back and forth to slowly unravel the story of the hijacking and his life afterwards. It turns out that Walt's life following his hijacking was even more incredible than everything that came before the hijacking. Lisa Story, Walt's niece, had a unique insight into Walter's life. They were pen pals for quite a while. With that said, I'd like to welcome Lisa to the podium to show her story to you. Thank you.
Walter Pica, also known as Rika, was my mom's brother, my mom Sandra. He was a really complex man who had many secrets, and he made many mistakes through his life. He and I became pen pals. I mean, I knew him a little bit as a little child and remember short visits, but we actually started a regular correspondence when I was a teenager and he was in the Middle East. He would send me very ornate, beautiful cards from the Middle East and share the information about the culture and encourage me to pursue my education. The first time I realized he didn't keep both feet on the right side of the law was when he sent me a fake birth certificate and ID so I could go out with my friends dancing. It said that I was a National Geographic journalist, and inside all the stamps, instead of being dates and locations, said important, important, important. The bouncers would laugh so hard they'd let me in. They said it was the funniest fake ID they ever saw. My mom and I and my daughter started visiting my uncle regularly in Michigan after 1999 when my grandma passed away. And we brought my daughters we would visit and talk with his with his friends, and they would share their stories of how they met, the crazy things that they did, how they made their ex-wives very angry, and the daring parachute jumps my uncle survived. There's one from January 1961 where he wrote simply, "broke both legs in a night jump." And that was with Ken Sisler, who was a Medal of Honor winner. Some of the stories that he shared showed kind of the crazy things that he would do. Like on a few occasions, he went to Sierra Leone and mined for diamonds. He brought some of those back. We have some of them in our family. He adopted a bartender who was an adult in order to get the permit that he needed to mine the diamonds. And then, showing a sense of humor, he had that young man call his ex-wife and still his confidant, Joni, and had the young man say, "Hi, Mom, I'm your new son." Carl and I came into contact right in about early 2000s to mid-2000s after my uncle had a serious illness and nearly passed away. And Carl was really concerned about my uncle and would call me to check in on him. And he was writing a book about my uncle based on the diamond mining, and I had read a draft. And so we would keep in contact both on letters and calls, and he wanted to make sure everything was okay with my uncle. And then at one point, Carl was actually the first person to tell me that my uncle was D.B. Cooper. I didn't doubt it for a minute, because knowing all of the things that he had done in his life and the type of person that he was, and also hearing other stories from my family about the poverty that they survived, the anger issues that he had, and I really didn't see that very often. I only saw it a couple times in my life, but it made complete sense. Also, looking at all of his parachute jumps, I have his log from his first 100 or so jumps in the late 1950s, early 1960s. So I started asking Walt questions when I'd visit, and I'd ask him about it and he wouldn't confirm or deny, but he'd say something like, "Well, if I had done something like this, this is what I would have done." The other thing he started to do is send me copies of newspaper articles with cheeky little comments on it about other people who claimed they were D.B. Cooper, or comments like, "Well, what about this? And how did they know that?" Walt was definitely a patriot, something that I think people should know about him. In the papers that I have, I find 4, 5, 6 different enlistments in the military. They started when he was a teenager, and he joined the Army in 1950. When he was in the Army National Guard, he was in the Air Force Pararescue. He served during the Berlin crisis. He served in South America with the Thunderbirds for a short time. He was also in Special Forces and in the Air Force Reserve with Pararescue and Escape and Evasion School. One of the stories that he would tell us often, and that he would pull out the certificates and the letters, and I think there's a letter back there that supports this, a copy of it, was that during 1991, with the first Desert Storm, before the troops went in, he notified the military that, and I honestly don't know what this means, and I've been meaning to look it up, but the H-2S threat that would face the soldiers should the Iraqis set the oil fields on fire. My uncle was really proud of the letter he got back saying that he saved many soldiers' lives. And I think from living in the Middle East and knowing the people and the situation and the politics, he suspected that the oil wells would be set on fire and that there would be a chemical release that could hurt the soldiers. Another story that he shared with us a lot, and it was an important story, and he mentioned this again when he passed away, was when he told the story, it was actually really funny, and it was told in more of a, if you can think armed robbery, it's funny. But he talked about the time he robbed a Bob's Big Boy with an empty Tommy gun. And he went in, and immediately when he got some of the money out, he immediately turned around and gave the female manager some of the money, and some of the patrons who didn't leave, he gave them and said, "This is for your troubles." And then he left, and when he left, his friend had parked on the wrong side of the street, and the police were just happening to be giving that person a parking ticket when they got on the radio a note that there was, or a call that there was someone robbing the Bob's Big Boy. So he was arrested, and when he was out on bail, he jumped bail. And that put him on the run and using aliases and into deeper poverty and having trouble holding down a job. When I asked him at the end if he regretted any of his decisions, well, let me just back up. In August 2013, his health was failing. And so my mom and I went to go be with him and to check on him, and we started packing up his files, his scrapbooks, and different information, tried to get him into hospice care, started working on that. He said to me, "There's a package over there from Carl. Can you go get it?" So I got the package, and it had some different paperwork in it, but it also had this confession that he had dictated to Carl. And he said, "Carl wants me to have this notarized. I'm going to sign it. Can you take it into town and get it notarized?" And I'm like, "Well, it doesn't really work that way. You have to be with me." And he wasn't really mobile at this point in time, and I didn't know, it's a really tiny town. I didn't know if I could find somebody and bring him to his house. So I started reading the paperwork, and it was the D.B. Cooper confession along with a couple other, some other information. And I asked him, "Is this true?" And he said, "Yes." And we talked about it, and I told him, don't sign this. And he said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "No, don't." He said, "Carl said I really need to notarize this in order to make it authentic." And I said, "Don't sign it, Uncle Walt. You know, if the notary reads these different names that you've used and sees this name, they're going to call the FBI, and they'll arrest you, and you'll spend the rest of your days in prison." And we knew he was dying. In fact, he did die a few months after that. I had read many articles about people who had committed crimes in their 30s or 40s and then were discovered in their 80s and were sent to prison, even if they were in ill health. So I really believed that that's what would happen. On the way to the airport, I had my mom read a copy of the papers, and she agreed, and she called him and said, don't sign this. In the end, and when we were talking, and I visited him one more time before he passed away, and I would ask him questions and talk a little bit about the hijacking. But one of the first things I said when he really finally admitted it was, "Wow, you're infamous, and you have lived such an adventurous life. You know, you must be so, I don't know, not proud of yourself, but you know, this is just amazing." And he's like, he did not agree with that. He said, "I wouldn't call it adventurous." He goes, "It was one mistake after another." He said the Bob's Big Boy was like the first big mistake because it was a felony, and he knew he'd go to jail, and he just couldn't serve time in jail. Well, that put him using aliases and being on the run, and to the point where he was so poor that he went in desperation and hijacked the airplane. And then because he hijacked the airplane, he ended up working for private contractors and doing jobs for the government that led him to do things that, you know, in the end, he was really concerned about his soul and about his salvation. I asked him, "Well, would you do any of it over again?" And he said the only thing he would do again is his friends. He never regretted his friendships and the time he spent with the Michigan parachute team and other friends that he made. These were lifelong friends. He met his best friend Willard in Juvie when he was 9 years old, and they both were friends up until they passed away. He passed away when he was 80. I'm here today to support Carl. He has spent so many years working on this story and talking to my uncle and sharing this information that we have. And my uncle, they were good friends. I mean, they talked constantly. I would be visiting, and Carl would be on the phone, and they would be talking. My uncle passed away on President's Day in 2014 with my mom and a couple friends by his side. And I think when I talked to her about this today, she wanted to just make sure that people understood that he was a real human being, that he wasn't perfect, but he wasn't a criminal. Even though he did criminal things, he had the caring side, he had the loving side, as well as he had, you know, the side of him that could do the things that he has done that a lot of them I think are in Carl's book. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. With that, I would like to open up the floor for a media-only Q&A. Additional interviews can be arranged following this portion of time. If You see the checkout desk out front. Anybody have any questions? Okay. Thank you once again for joining us today. We will begin private interviews now. You will find a link and a password to the digital press kit at the check-in table. There are also artifacts from Walt's life presented in that corner over there for your inspection. We will be holding a book signing of Carl's memoir, D.B. Cooper and Me, this evening at 5:30 at Schuler Books, right here in Grand Rapids. If you have any additional questions, you can reach us at media@principiamedia.com. Thank you.